Hi, my name is Matt, and I'm a doctoral researcher in the history faculty here in Cambridge, where you'll normally find me reading, writing, thinking and teaching about the politics and propaganda of the late Roman Empire. For the next 25 minutes or so, I want to give you a very small taste of what an undergraduate lecture in my field might be like by talking to you about a riot and a statue. Now, if you've been following certain recent events, at least in their media representations, you might be thinking, doesn't sound very historical to me. And we'll come to the present relevance of the topic at the very end, because part of why we might take a history degree is to learn how to think critically about and better analyse what's going on around us today. But the statue we'll be looking at isn't in Bristol or London, and in fact it isn't currently anywhere because it hasn't existed for about 500 years. But we can't let a little thing like that stop us from doing some history. There's a drawing of this statue on your screens. It's the equestrian statue of the late Roman Emperor Justinian I, who ruled between 527 and 565. The statue was built in Constantinople, now Istanbul, but then the capital of the Roman Empire, shortly after a violent event which we call the Nika Riot or the Nika Insurrection in 532. We'll be concentrating on this event and on how the Justinianic state responded to it. So our sample question is, how did the Emperor Justinian reassert his legitimacy after the Nika Riot? And since this lecture is just a short taster, we'll be zooming in repeatedly to focus on ever more particular details, which will leave us some way short of a balanced and solid historical argument. Producing that would be a job for you, the students, in your independent work. Now, I've picked this question because it should hopefully be fairly conceptually straightforward in letting us achieve three important learning goals. So we're going to learn about the historical context of the Nika Riot and its state response, which will tell us some things about how phenomena like resistance, power, and memory operated back in the 6th century. To do that, we'll have to develop techniques for dealing with difficult spatial sources, and these techniques will be applicable to other parts of history, including right here, right now. And because we're being very focused on a single source, we'll end by raising further questions about the Nika Riot and more generally about urban space, statues, and how they might relate to the way humans think about and conceptualize the world. So in roughly 20 minutes' time, just over, we'll have some new historical knowledge. We'll have extracted some useful tactics for doing all sorts of historical and intellectual work. And we'll be going away better equipped to grapple independently with some big questions about the world. And that's a pretty good summary of what an undergraduate lecture should be trying to do. So let's get started. In 532, early in Justinian's reign, something very normal happens in Constantinople, an outbreak of sporting hooliganism. Not at a football match, of course. The big sport in late antiquity was chariot racing, and the two major racing teams were the Blues and the Greens. These factions were integral to the city's social life. It really did matter which one you belonged to. And for the most part, that was not really a question of politics or religion or class, but more straightforwardly, racing fanaticism. Unlike many heated sporting rivalries, violence between the Blues and the Greens wasn't uncommon. In January of 532, the state tried to get a handle on some of this violence by executing a small number of factionalists. But two were lucky enough to escape, and in response, the Blues and the Greens set aside their rivalry and turned their anger together on Justinian's regime. We should probably be imagining some longer-running grievances amongst the urban population, even if the escape of the condemned men was the immediate trigger. Over the next week, sporting violence turned into the Nika insurrection. The rioters proclaimed a new emperor and set fire to much of the city centre, particularly targeting buildings that were emblematic of the state, like the residences of the officials responsible for the executions, the Imperial Church, the bronze gates to the Imperial Palace, and so on. At one point during this week, Justinian is on the verge of abdicating by fleeing the city and giving the rioters what they want. But in the end, he puts down the revolt by roping in some troops from outside the city, trapping the insurrectionists in the hippodrome here where the races took place, and slaughtering roughly 35,000 of his own subjects. There's more to this narrative, and lots of ways we could use Nika and other similar riots to think about the sites and tactics of popular and political power in the 6th century. But let's zoom in for the first time, because we want to know where the imperial regime went from here, since it should be pretty obvious that Justinian will be suffering a bit of a legitimacy problem at this point. Nika has revealed the possible fragility of his rule and the regime's dependence on force in the face of popular uprising. And on an immediate level, the emperor is dealing with the legacy of 35,000 dead citizens, a grieving urban population made up of their friends and families, and a city centre which has just been burned to the ground. So what's the response? We could explore a few different ones. First of all, Justinian sends out a notice of victory to all the other cities that says something like, "Don't go getting any funny ideas, else the same will happen to you." But in Constantinople itself, he takes a much less abrasive tack. So at some point during the rebuilding of the Hagia Sophia Church, the famous hymn writer Romanos performs this probably commissioned interpretation of the riot as a divine punishment by God for the sins of all the city's inhabitants, emperor included, making Nika a story of shared blame, not angry revolt, which might diffuse some lingering tensions. But we're going to park that and zoom in again on what Justinian did with the empty spaces left over from the destruction. And I'm doing that because urban space particularly accentuates Justinian's legitimacy problem. The riot has left a physical mark on the city, and we know from both the science and theory of memory that space is a potent mnemonic trigger, i.e., as individuals and as groups, we often imprint memories on the spaces associated with them and then recall these events and emotions by being in those spaces, which you might test out at home by going somewhere that you haven't been in a while. And we know also that the memory of the Nika insurrection was what we call spatially inscribed in this way and deeply ingrained in the minds of contemporaries. So here, a whole 2 decades later, the civil servant John Lydus is remembering what the city was like after Nika, and he calls the city a mountain of black, severed mounds, just like on a volcano, uninhabitable because of the dust, the smoke, and the foul smell of wood burned down to ash, stirring a horrible panic in anyone who looked upon it. The city, he says, had been cast into fire and ruins. Now, John might be exaggerating for some literary effect, but even so, it's the sort of scene that would definitely stick in your mind. And that's not a very helpful memory for a state which had spent at least a couple of centuries filling those same urban spaces with the ideological symbols of imperial power, and therefore conditioning its subjects to accept a particular type of imperial rule. So for as long as the memory of the insurrection and its suppression was easily accessible from the spaces in which the city's population lived and worked, Justinian's subjects were engaged in a daily remembrance of rebellion, destruction, and state violence. And we see Justinian trying to fix this space problem as he rebuilds the destroyed spaces by taking the opportunity to re-embed a lot of self-representative propaganda in the physical fabric of the city. So the Bronze Gate comes back, full of images of Justinian's military triumphs. And so does the Hagia Sophia, bigger, better, and with even more glorious imperial representations. But let's zoom in again on one particular space, the Augustaion, right here, a public square in front of the Hagia Sophia and the Imperial Palace, which had been used as a marketplace for regular people to shop, chat, listen to performances, and so on. Justinian rebuilds the square a little bit smaller than it was before, and right in the middle of it, he slaps a great big column with a statue of himself riding a horse on top. Our question? Why? What was this statue meant to do for the emperor, specifically in relation to his post-Nika legitimacy problem? And the first difficulty with answering that question is that the statue no longer exists, which, for us, is only going to be a minor hurdle. Our first job is to collect the surviving evidence for the statue, and I'll rattle through our 4 main sources and let you pause the video if you want a moment to study them more closely, because I'm only going to pick out the most relevant aspects. So we have this nearly contemporary description from the 550s, written by the conservative critic Procopius as part of what we call his panegyric in praise of Justinian. So that's a piece of political rhetoric, which we should probably avoid simply mining for information that we haven't corroborated elsewhere. We also have a much later description from the 13th century by a writer who lived in Constantinople called Pachimeres. We have this close-up drawing of the statue from the 15th century, which we've already had a quick look at, and we also have a bunch of later medieval drawings and woodcuts of the city of Constantinople, which include some representations of the statue. And for the sake of simplicity, let's just pick one of these to work with. Now we can start by picking out various concordances between these sources to tell us what aspects of this imperial representation were most visible or most striking to its viewers. Clearly, it's a very tall column, one of the most prominent features of the city's skyline for hundreds of years. And the emperor on top of the column is depicted as a conqueror, in a heroicized form apparently easily recognizable as the classical hero Achilles. His horse looked like it was running, so this is an action-packed emperor as though he's leading some sort of cavalry charge, although Justinian was never that sort of ruler. And finally, he was holding a representation of the global Christian empire in one hand and stretching out his other. That all seems fairly straightforward. The emperor as a heroic Christian conqueror isn't particularly uncommon iconography, and we can see that from this roughly contemporary ivory depiction of a ruler who we think might be Justinian. But let's zoom in on one more striking aspect of these sources. It seems notable to most of them that the statue was facing east. And to find out why that struck our sources, whether they were writing about or depicting the statue, we need to put it in its spatial context. So here is a map of medieval Constantinople's city centre, with the location of a statue marked by that cross. We know that it faced in that direction. And here I've highlighted a street called the Messe, which was the primary economic and ceremonial artery of the city. Thousands of regular people will have moved along it in their daily routines and will have lined the streets for regular imperial processions like the one that's being described here, which always finished at the Augustaion underneath the statue. And the spatial relationship between the Messe and the statue explains why its orientation was so striking. Because as the city's population moved around in their everyday lives, going to work, shopping for food, heading to the Hagia Sophia for religious services, or lining the streets for processions, they must routinely have gazed on the back of the emperor's head. Now, if we were to face the statue to the west, we get some obvious advantages. The urban population, existing under the metaphorical surveillance of the emperor, and some potent face-to-face confrontations between the real emperor and his heroic bronze representation during processions. But our first source, Procopius, gives us a clue as to what was gained by the emperor with that slightly jarring eastwards orientation. Procopius sees the emperor looking to where the sun rises in the east, watching against the Persians. The Persians were the primary military threat to the Roman Empire in the 6th century, and so by noticeably facing his equestrian statue to the east towards Persia, Justinian reminded his subjects of the existence of dangerous barbarians out there in the east, and modelled himself as the heroic Christian emperor who could protect the city from them. And his urban subjects weren't just reminded of the threat, but in every daily action they were asked to perform the roles of loyal imperial subjects, falling into line behind the ruler leading the charge. As an aside, it didn't need to be the case that the Persians might genuinely invade Constantinople or pose a threat to the physical safety of anyone who lived there. It only needed to be true that the threat could be represented as feasible, or that the Persians were endangering other things that Roman subjects had been ideologically conditioned to value, like the size of their imperial territories. Knowing this, let's put the statue back in the context of Nika. We said earlier that the spatially inscribed memory of Nika, of domestic rebellion and domestic state violence, posed a legitimacy problem for Justinian. And in response to that problem, the equestrian statue tried to overwrite that memory by redirecting the urban population's attention to the eastern frontier and fashioning the emperor on a visible, everyday basis, not as a violent autocrat, but as a watchful, heroic protector. In other words, the statue was not doing what we think statues should do, which was to commemorate something. That job was better done elsewhere, like by this inscription in the Hippodrome, which commemorated the victories Justinian claimed to have won over Persia. Rather, our statue was a project in remaking the priorities of Justinian's subjects, shaping what weighed on their minds as they moved about the city centre, and moulding his subjects as subjects who once again rebel against the ruler on whom they and their empire relied. So what have we learned from this? Let's go back to our learning goals. We've certainly picked up some new historical knowledge. We've covered a narrative of the insurrection, but more importantly, we've discussed the problems of resistance, legitimacy, and memory as far as they relate to space, and we've touched on how the power to control and make spaces bleeds over into the power to control and make subjects. And that's a process that is worth thinking about in any place, at any time. There's still a long way to go from here to make a convincing historical argument. And your job as students might be to develop this analysis into a pattern of varying state responses, or to broaden it by asking what the statue was doing in other contexts at other times for other viewers, or to challenge it by introducing evidence you found that I've missed out. And we've developed a framework and some techniques that might help you to do that by understanding space and its relationship with power. We've seen how to securely reconstruct difficult material by comparing sources from different media with each other, and we've seen how to contextualize an architectural source, thinking not just about what it looked like, but also where it was, what part of it was visible to whom and from where, how it related to other buildings and spaces. In this case, how it helped to produce the built environment of Constantinople and imbue it with particular meanings and priorities. So far, we've been thinking largely in terms of intent. What was the regime trying to do or say in its architectural response to Nika? But by using literary descriptions of the statue, we've also begun to touch on the more important idea of reception or effect, measuring how the statue was really experienced, ideally by different sorts of people at different times, and asking how far that intent was successfully executed, or whether those spatial meanings that the regime wanted to construct were contested. That construction of spatial meaning and its potential for crafting priorities, memory, and subjectivity brings us on to our final goal. We already have lots of immediate questions to ask about the 6th century, but I promised that we would end talking about the present relevance of the topic. And in the UK, from newsrooms to the streets, statues have been much discussed in 2020. Here they are all over the national press. Here, in the tweets of the political leaders of the UK's 2 largest parties, and here in my family WhatsApp. This debate about bringing down certain statues, framed rightly by the Black Lives Matter movement, isn't immediately connected to today's topic, because we've been learning about the installation, not the removal, of a statue. But for many, it's been a debate about history and memory, about erasing or making history, about commemoration and who should be commemorated. What we've seen today is that statues aren't just commemorations that we learn from and otherwise treat as historical artifacts. In fact, our statue is a pretty poor commemoration of anything. The horse even has a different emperor's name on it because Justinian had simply pinched it from somebody else. So by the time of Pechimeraes, there's no mention of Persians or Nika or Justinian at all, just a generalised idea of the Christian conqueror. So the primary function of the statue historically was not to commemorate or memorialise, but to reproduce and focus centuries of ideological assumptions about imperial rule. So the last further question I want to raise is whether a similar process applies to all our statues and the way in which they slot into urban spaces more broadly. In addition to commemorating, do they, like Justinian's equestrian statue, function as instruments of power, memory, and ideology? That is, the way in which the world around us seems instinctively to make sense or be normal, causing us to make priorities, think, and behave in certain ways without even knowing that that's what we're doing. Should we be asking whether of a statue from the 6th century or just down the road, not only is this a worthy commemoration, but also how is this little bit of space structured, and what does that do to the way that we're asked to conceptualise the world? Should we individualise our ideas of history and of power? Which narrative should and shouldn't be inscribed in public space? And what does contesting those narratives look like? Now, I won't tell you my own answers to these questions because that's not really the point of a lecture. But maybe, if you weren't already, I can get you to start asking them. Thank you.